You weren't meant to hear this story. The Lancaster courthouse keeps the files sealed in climate-controlled silence. 4 deaths between 1837 and 1841. Each ruled accident or illness. But if you listen close, the paper still whispers. It tells of 4 men, all husbands, all buried before 45, and the 4 Irish sisters they married. Their names were Brennan, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, Sarah, the last daughters of a dying empire of land and blood. The records claim it was fog that took the attorney, drowning that claimed the banker, illness for the judge, a fall into his own well for the sheriff. But the records lie not out of ignorance, but obedience. Because in 1830s Pennsylvania, property meant power, and power had rules written only for men. Their father, Patrick Brennan, had built an empire of 847 acres stone house, barns, fields so rich they could feed half the county. But when he died without sons, the law would carve it apart. Equal division among daughters, each parcel shrinking until the farm was a ghost of what it had been. The sisters understood this better than the men around them. They'd been trained in silence, to pour tea, to smile, to agree. But while the men spoke of honor, the sisters studied loopholes. They learned that the law could be bent by marriage, that property could flow through a widow's hands untouched. They learned, too, that affection was a kind of contract and that every contract can be rewritten. That's where the story begins. 4 young women in black gathered around the kitchen fire after their father's funeral, the wind outside scraping the shutters, the candlelight turning their faces into masks. They weren't plotting murder, not yet. They were plotting survival. "We stay together," Bridget said, "no matter what the law says." "The law," Catherine murmured, "was written by men who never lost a home." And Sarah, the youngest, the softest, spoke the line that would echo through 4 graves and a century of silence. "Husbandsty." Sisters don't. Outside, the land waited acres of frost, a kingdom built on the bones of old men and the will of 4 women who'd learned that power doesn't disappear. It simply changes hands. The first of the 4 to marry was Bridget Brennan, the eldest, the strategist, the one who understood that power doesn't come from possession, but from perception. In Lancaster County, perception meant respectability. So she crafted herself into a myth, a grieving daughter turned perfect bride. Thomas Hennessy never stood a chance. He was the county's most prominent attorney, a widower, wealthy, devout, respected by every man who mattered. But power attracts hunger. When he met Bridget at Sunday Mass, she was draped in black silk, her eyes lowered just enough to seem modest and haunted. She asked him about his cases as if she admired him. He mistook curiosity for innocence. By Christmas, they were engaged. The marriage contract was a masterpiece of quiet rebellion drafted under Hennessy's own seal. It created a family trust that ensured the land would remain whole and pass entirely to the surviving widow. Bridget called it a gesture of love. In truth, it was a weapon, one the sisters had designed in the lamplight months before. Yet what makes this story dark isn't murder. It's obedience, how the law itself cleared the path for it. A woman in 1837 had no property rights. Once married, everything she owned became her husband's. But the loophole was widowhood. In death, men returned what life had stolen. The law, written to protect them, betrayed them. That winter, Hennessy moved into the Brennan farmhouse. He found the sisters still living there, 4 women sharing meals, prayers, and secrets that ended when the door shut. Bridget called it devotion to family. He called it improper. But he stayed. Men like him always stayed, believing they ruled the household while the walls listened to someone else. Neighbors said the sisters were pious, diligent, too close. They said the Brennans prayed together long after midnight. The men of Lancaster smiled at their beauty and pitied their lack of husbands, not realizing they were prey being studied. The first death came 14 months later. The fog was thick that morning, swallowing the road. Hennessy's horse returned home alone, saddle empty, eyes wild. The coroner wrote accident. Bridget wore black again and never remarried. In her account book, next to the entry for his funeral expenses, she added one final note in careful script. The land remains whole. Lancaster County learned to whisper around the Brennan women. The attorney's funeral had drawn every judge, banker, and sheriff within 50 miles. They had come out of respect for Thomas Hennessy, but they stayed for the spectacle, the four black-clad sisters standing together at the edge of the grave, motionless as carved stone. A gust tore through the cemetery and snuffed half the candles, and someone muttered that the earth itself had taken notice. Within weeks, sympathy turned to curiosity. Who would care for the widowed Bridget? Who would guide those fragile sisters through their grief? Lancaster's most eligible men began to call men who believed tragedy made women pliant. They found instead a fortress disguised as mourning. Catherine, the second sister, opened the door to each caller. She had a way of listening that stripped men of pretense. A tilt of the head, a soft question about their estates, and the most guarded secrets spilled like confession. She never promised affection. She offered understanding. It was more addictive than love. By autumn, she was engaged to Edward Price, the banker whose institution held half the county's mortgages. His courtship was brisk, almost desperate. He believed he had chosen her. In truth, he had been chosen the moment his signature could stabilize the Brennan trust. Bridget handled the legalities, all within the boundaries of law. No one saw the power shift taking place. The merging of assets, the quiet transfer of deeds, the way each transaction stitched the farm tighter together. The town saw charity and compliance. What they missed was design. On the first Sunday after Catherine's wedding, the sisters sat together in the family pew. The priest spoke of divine order, of a woman's duty to her husband. Bridget's eyes never left the crucifix above the altar. She whispered, "Men build laws. God builds loopholes." The following spring, Mill Creek ran high with rain. Edward Price went riding along its bank to inspect his flooded properties. His horse returned without him. They found his body 2 days later, face down in water shallow enough for a child to stand in. Another coroner's report. Another widow. The farm remained whole. And in Lancaster's drawing rooms, men began lowering their voices when the Brennan name was spoken. Not out of suspicion, out of something colder. Recognition. By 1839, the name Brennan carried a strange kind of gravity. No lawman accused them of wrongdoing. No priest dared imply sin. Yet every man who dined at their table left feeling smaller. The sisters moved through Lancaster society as if guided by an older rulebook, one that men could sense but not read. Bridget ran the farm like a magistrate. Catherine managed the accounts with Edward Price's ledgers now legally hers. Margaret, the third sister, became the face of the family in public, radiant and serene, hosting gatherings where wine flowed and gossip evaporated into polite fear. Sarah sang at these dinners, her voice soft as confession. The sisters understood presentation. Power works best when mistaken for grace. But Lancaster's order was fraying. The banker's death had stirred unease in the courthouse, where judges and merchants met behind closed doors to ask whether coincidence could stretch so far. Yet each inquiry died the same death: respectability. The sisters were devout, generous, untouchable by rumor. To question them was to question the county's own virtue. That summer, Judge Alfred Lloyd visited the Brennan estate to advise the widows on new estate law. He arrived confident, a man accustomed to obedience, and left smitten by Margaret's poise. Within months they were married. The county celebrated what it believed to be restoration. A nobleman reclaiming the household of widows. In truth, he had stepped into their design. Margaret never argued with him. She listened, smiled, and filed away every decree he pronounced. She learned which clerks he trusted, which statutes he ignored. Through him, the sisters acquired access to sealed inheritance records, tax ledgers, probate files. Information is currency. The Brennans were now rich beyond gold. By harvest season of 1840, the judge was ill. Fevers, tremors, delirium. The town physician blamed tainted grain. Others whispered about the water. Bridget arranged for the funeral herself, efficient, dignified, final. The following Sunday, the sisters donated new altar cloths to the church embroidered with a single line from Proverbs. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. Lancaster's men read it as virtue. The sisters knew it was prophecy. The land remained whole. And now, brother, stop, breathe. If you've followed me this far into their silence, you've already crossed a line most never see. Write this in the comments twice to mark that you understand what power truly costs. The land remembers. Write it again to remind yourself you are no longer innocent of how control survives. By the winter of 1841, Lancaster County was quiet again, too quiet. The sheriff kept his distance from the Brennan estate, though he was seen often enough riding past at dusk, a lantern swinging from his saddle. His name was William Keene. He was younger than the others had been, ambitious, proud of the badge that gave him license to question anyone except the people who truly held power. He had known Bridget since childhood, had danced once with Margaret at a harvest fair. He convinced himself the stories about the sisters were superstition, rural hysteria born of envy. When the judge's death left yet another estate entangled with the Brennan Trust, Keene decided to look into it. Not officially, of course. Just a man satisfying his own curiosity. That is how power's machinery always begins, to turn someone believing he's the exception. The sisters received him graciously. Sarah poured the tea. Catherine spoke of faith and providence. Bridget thanked him for his diligence. They knew the rhythm of interrogation. Soothe, deflect, listen. He stayed too long. By the third visit, his questions had softened into admiration. Men who believe they are rescuing women rarely notice when the script changes. Outside the farmhouse, the county was changing. Factories were rising near the turnpike. Speculators were offering to buy farmland for canals and mills. The Brennans refused every offer. Their land was not property, it was identity. The soil beneath their boots carried the weight of fathers and exiles, of the law that once tried to divide them. They guarded it the way the law guarded men. When Keene disappeared, the town reacted not with outrage but exhaustion. A search was made, a report written. Days later, his horse was found grazing near the Brennan well. At the bottom, beneath 6 feet of water, the sheriff waited. The coroner wrote, "Accidental fall." The sisters paid for the funeral, attended the mass, and returned home in silence. The circle was complete. 4 men, for graves, for signatures securing the estate. No jurikenbind. No evidence remained. The land remained whole. Yet something in Lancaster had shifted. Men walked faster past the Brennan gate. Women watched the sisters with a mixture of fear and fascination. Because everyone sensed the same forbidden truth. That power, once taken, does not return. It simply changes its name. Decades later, old men in taverns would still lower their voices when the Brennan name came up. They'd talk about that stretch of land off Mill Creek, how its fences never aged, how its owners never seemed to want for anything. No one spoke of witchcraft. Lancaster was too pious for that. They spoke, instead of discipline, of women who understood what men forgot, that order is built by those willing to pay for it in silence. After the sheriff's funeral, the sisters withdrew. The farmhouse gates stayed closed. The church bells tolled each Sunday, and the Brennans knelt in the same pew their father had bought. They donated grain to the poor and money to the parish school. The county praised them as examples of virtue. In truth, their charity was strategy. Generosity buys loyalty more cheaply than fear. Bridget aged first, her hair silvering into the color of frost. She managed the farm with military precision, memorizing every debt owed and every favor granted. Catherine ran correspondence through intermediaries in Philadelphia, ensuring their names never appeared beside transactions. Margaret became a recluse, writing by candlelight until dawn. Journals, letters, ledgers, an archive of control hidden behind the walls. Sarah, still the voice of the family, tended the church choir, her hymns a camouflage of devotion. Together, they built an empire of legitimacy. By 1850, the Brennan Trust quietly owned portions of 3 neighboring farms, a mill, and a warehouse on the turnpike. Each acquisition appeared ordinary, the product of careful investment. But beneath the ink and parchment lay the same design: consolidation. A lesson learned not from ambition, but from inheritance. You see, what the sisters created wasn't a mystery, it was a mirror. They copied the very hierarchy that had once erased them, mastering its language until the system could no longer tell who was master and who was servant. That's the quiet trick of history. Rebellion dressed as compliance. When people later called them cursed, they missed the point. The curse was never blood, it was law. It was the doctrine that told women to obey, immigrants to labor, the poor to wait their turn. The Brennans simply reversed the current. And if you're listening now, wondering what any of this has to do with you, remember, every power that governs you was built the same way. Signed, sealed, sanctified, then hidden behind respectability. Time eventually claimed them one by one. Bridget went first in the spring of 1857, her heart giving out as she sat at her desk balancing the ledgers. Catherine followed a year later, her mind fading into quiet delirium. Margaret died in 1860, leaving behind volumes of notes, half legal records, half confessions. Sarah lingered longest, tending the land until her hair turned the color of ash. When she was found dead in her chair before the fire, the accounts were still current, taxes paid, boundaries intact. The will they left behind was a masterpiece of restraint. No heirs, no sale clauses. The estate passed to the church in perpetual stewardship with one stipulation: the land could never be divided. Not for taxes, not for settlement, not for God himself. The clause remains in effect to this day. People say their ghosts wander the creek road, for shadows moving together through the fog. But legends always miss the truth. Ghosts aren't the dead, they're the structures they leave behind. The Brennan sisters didn't haunt Lancaster with superstition. They haunted it with precedent. Every deed written afterward bore their echo. The way power preserves itself through language and ink, not flesh and blood. By the 20th century, historians had reduced them to a curiosity, a family of widows, victims of coincidence. The official story still calls it tragedy. The county archives still hold 4 separate case files, each sealed in dust. Yet every law student who studies inheritance in Pennsylvania learns a phrase from those files. The land remains whole. It appears in margin notes, in judgments, in obscure footnotes about trust law. Their signature has become part of the system. That's how power works. It doesn't need to survive in memory. It survives in policy. It doesn't need worshippers. It needs participants. You pay taxes, you sign contracts, you obey codes that trace back to stories like there's people who refuse to lose what define them. So, when you drive through Lancaster County and see those fences cutting the fog, understand what you're looking at. You're not seeing farmland. You're seeing the bones of a law that learned to protect itself. And perhaps, in that sense, the Brennan sisters never died at all. They simply became the law. You can still stand on the edge of their land. Mill Creek hasn't changed much, same silt smell, same low fog in the mornings. The farmhouse is gone, but the stones are still there, reused in barns and foundations. Everything that was visible has weathered away. What remains are the rules that outlived them. When you read the county records, it looks so clean. Property lines, tax valuations, the language of order. But the truth beneath those words is the same as it ever was. Every signature on a deed is someone saying, "I will not be forgotten." That's what law really protects, not justice, but memory. And memory is just another name for control. The Brennan sisters learned this before most men ever suspected it. They discovered that obedience and defiance speak the same tongue if you understand the grammar of power. They didn't overthrow the system, they mastered it, hid inside it, became invisible within its perfection. That's the most dangerous knowledge of all. That you don't have to break a cage if you learn to hold the key from the inside. Think about the systems you live under, the contracts you sign without reading, the traditions you defend without knowing their origins, the loyalties that feel like choice but were written before you were born. The faces change, but the architecture remains. The Brennan farm is gone, yet the logic that built it still shapes your world. Inheritance, ownership, legitimacy. Those are just polite words for possession. This isn't a ghost story. It's an X-ray of civilization. Every age buries its architects, then worships the blueprints they left behind. We call it progress because we no longer hear the prayers underneath. So when you walk through your own life, sign a contract, take a loan, pledge a vow, remember that you are standing in the long shadow of those who understood what power costs. Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, Sarah. For names that remind you every structure has a price, and someone already paid it. The land remains whole. Whisper it once for them. Whisper it again for yourself. Because once you see how power survives, you can never go back to innocence. You can only decide what you'll do with the knowledge that the world was never divided by accident. Subscribe for more forbidden histories. Share this with someone ready to see the systems that shape the world. Remember, power survives even when its architects are gone.